That's the critical question, I think, Representative Chu, Assemblyman Chu, sorry. I wouldn't have agreed to take this position. I didn't need it. I wasn't seeking it. I'm not a member of the California Bar if I didn't care deeply about the good functioning of a legal system. And I think, in contrast to what you said, what I knew about the State Bar when I agreed to be interviewed was the remarkable work it had done with inclusion and diversity, creating, I think, 16 systems of educating children who might not otherwise think about a career in law. I had a different impression than you did. I was surprised when I arrived to realize that the management dysfunction that I was inheriting, the legacy system I've described, was much deeper than what I imagined. Indeed, our president has asked me, would I have taken the job had I known then what I know now? It's a fair question. Having said that, however, I believe that we can turn it around. I have a remarkable set of teammates. I think in a short period of time, we've demonstrated, if I can build on your metaphor, that we're not just shifting the chairs on the Titanic. We are digging deeply into how the bar is organized and functions. And I do believe that given not infinite time, because you're right, time is passing, we have to get this straightened around, but I think next year we will be in a different position than we are this year, where we are frankly about the business 24/7 of cleaning up problems that, while I've acknowledged we now own them, we didn't originate. So yes, I think there's reason to hope. Now, I'm not taking the position that we ought not to consider changing the structure of the bar. Indeed, you can look at other models, and there's an argument that perhaps it would be a better structure if it were smaller, more focused. But I do think before we do that, before we further unsettle an organization that really is in turmoil as a result of so much change going on now, we need to get through the current transformation and then decide what's the best structure for California.
If I could just conclude, if I had to vote today, if this was what the chair had recommended, I would be very open to supporting de-unification. I think the idea of splitting the bar into a regulatory agency and a trade association following 18 states, which tend to include the generally larger states, with dues payments lower than for the de-unified bar, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think what Mr. Menger has laid out has made sense. And again, this is someone who has paid probably close to about $20,000 of bar dues since I've become a member of this bar. And I will also say that I've considered taking my name off this bill, but I do understand that that would stall reform. And so I do think that the flexibility of what we have at this moment to allow us to publicly deliberate the best way to address challenges is important. But at this point, I've been thinking about this now for a year and a half, and I think we have to act. I think we have to be a bit more decisive than the time frame that's being suggested. I'm concerned that if we continue to wait, we will just continue down the same path of history, and I will be saying to my 7-week-old child, who, when he becomes an attorney, you know, Daddy could have had a chance to fix the bar, but he didn't. And so I look forward to working with you. And again, I want to say I do believe that the current leadership of the bar, you are doing what you can, but at this point, I'm concerned that it's too little, too late.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, did you want to add something?
Well, this is a complex process. I'm glad we're asking questions of the bar. I'm going to stitch a lot of this together and talk specifically to the committee about what this bill is and where we're going. I'll do that on my close. I'm happy to also answer questions, but yeah, I do have something to say on all of this, because I think this is what you're asking and what you're going to be a part of, or I'm going to ask you all to be a part of.
All right. We'll wait for that eagerly in your close. I have a couple more comments. Mr. Alejo, followed by Mr. Gallagher, and then Ms. Garcia.
Thank you very much. I won't repeat everything that both of my colleagues said. I think you're hearing from both sides of the aisle a lot of the concerns that have come out as a result of the State Bar and the transparency that has been provided to the legislature and the public about the ingrained problems within our State Bar. And we have to put it bluntly, and for the public to hear, that we're cognizant of their concerns, but the State Bar did put the public at risk by not doing a thorough job in in carrying out one of its missions, which is the protection of the legal profession to ensure the highest level of competency. When the State Bar was collecting dues in excess of their expenses and having $32 million in surplus, and instead of focusing on the backlog, purchasing buildings, it certainly, I think, upsets all of us who are part of the legal profession, but certainly the victims who lost out because their complaint or the discipline against that particular attorney wasn't taken seriously by the State Bar. And as my colleague from San Francisco pointed out, many times that they were settled leniently or they were dismissed outright. And so that's very concerning for us. But the other mission of the bar is also equal access to justice. And in this bill and in past efforts and in my meetings with the State Bar, there's been very little effort to look out for the most vulnerable, the poorest residents in our state. As you all know, the IOLTA trust accounts that fund legal aid organizations in California, those rates have been at all-time low, haven't increased for numerous years. The Legal Service Corporation, which is our federal funding, has made cuts to our nonprofits, and these are the people who serve those that cannot afford a private attorney. And when the State Bar is not addressing those issues, even having conversations with the legislature or advocating how do we properly fund services to the poor in our state, that's concerning too, because there's a silence coming out of an organization who should be advocating for the poorest among us. I'm doing my job this year trying to push, as a former legal aid attorney, trying to make sure we're providing legal services for the poor. But when the State Bar has these other issues, but at the same time are completely silent on an issue that we all know is severe, our poor have nowhere else to go when they're being evicted, when we have problems with the Social Security claim, unemployment insurance, whatever their issue may be. If we're not properly providing funding, especially in light of economic recovery, and we haven't made any effort either to reinstate the non-mandatory dues or including additional ideas to address this concern in this particular funding bill, it's very troubling to me. And I think I'd like to hear how is the State Bar, I know you're dealing with a lot of other issues and trying to clean up a mess that you inherited, but what is the State Bar doing to address what we all know is a critical need in funding legal services for our nonprofit legal aid organizations?
Well, actually, Assemblyman Alejo, our president, David Pasternak, has made this a cause this year, and I can't understand how he would have missed you, but he has been in the Capitol talking with both senators and assemblymen on countless times, trying to see if there are not ways to take the Equal Access Fund and increase it. So this has been, what shall we say, something that's been almost an obsession on his part. And I will make sure that he's in touch with you because I suspect that ideas you might share with him could be helpful.
Well, I've been here 6 years and a member of Judiciary, and I have yet, my 6 years, I'm leaving this year, I'm yet to hear the State Bar ever advocate for legal services for the poor.
I would just add that this year the State Bar received $44 million from the nationwide class action against the banks having to do with the loan modification crisis. And that money is going to be allocated by our legal services group of the State Bar, who is currently working with a broad-based coalition of legal service providers primarily to develop the criteria by which those funds will be allocated. So this represents an incredible opportunity for the bar and for our legal services community in California to benefit under the terms of the settlement. Those funds need to be used to advance economic development or to address loan modification issues in particular. But the broad category of economic development does give us, again, a really significant opportunity to increase funding for legal services providers statewide. So that is happening right now.
Ms. Garcia.
I'm not a member of the bar, not an attorney, but I've been on this committee for 4 years. So yeah, so I have been hearing these issues now for a while. But I have very strong opinions about reform and governance structures in general, and and making sure that our governing structures fulfill the promise to our public, especially our most vulnerable individuals out there. And when I hear about these immigrants and the lack of support that they need and their files just being stuck in a drawer, it's really disheartening given the values that I have and what I'm here to do in this body. I think given the history and the fact that the bar at times will start to reform itself, we stop paying attention, and we fall down the same pathway. I don't think we're in a place to keep giving opportunities anymore. We have too many vulnerable individuals at risk on a regular basis, and I think we've given enough opportunities. I think that the audit and the transparency that we voted on is giving us an opportunity to really come to terms with the fact that our governing structure doesn't work here, and it needs to be rethought and restructured to make sure that these vulnerable individuals are getting the service they need and that the bar is fulfilling its promise to the public out there. I don't believe that this organization deserves another opportunity. I have plenty of organizations like this that are not legal organizations but have been given lots of opportunities. And every time the scandal gets bigger, every time the atrocities against the public get bigger, and every time the opinion of electeds or lawyers gets worse and worse. And so for myself as an individual, I feel that it's time that we turn it around and we start to rebuild that trust. And the only way to do that is by really rethinking the governance structure. Your legacy is going to be one day eliminated. Whatever changes you're making today or you plan to make in the next year, the next person or the next time we're not paying attention, it's going to go away like it's gone constantly. And so sitting here, I don't want to have another year. This is my 4th year on this committee. I don't want to have another year where I see the same problems and it's only getting worse and worse. Or I don't want to come 12 years later and say, oh, there's another audit and we did have improvements, but we went back that same slippery slope and we fall further down. And in the meantime, more and more vulnerable individuals are out there on their own. And so I do hope that as this bill moves, and because it has my names, that we don't wait any further. I would like to see that we have a real governance structure change, and whether it's decoupling or something else, I do think we need to take that seriously, and I do think that this bar is out of time, at least in my eyes.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher.
Yeah, I mean, for me, we have to execute our oversight function as the legislature, and I don't think we would be doing that in good faith if we didn't really delve into this. And I appreciate that that there's new management and people are trying to do new things, but as Assemblyman Chu said, we've seen that before. We've seen that too many times before. If you look back, there's always, okay, this is the new group coming in, we're going to make changes. Maybe things get better for a little bit, but then we're right back to this. So I think, for me, I'm inclined to not support authorizing fees until I can feel comfortable that some real reforms and changes have happened here. And I know it's probably rich coming from us about talking about debt, and from the state of California considering the debt and obligations that we're under, but nonetheless, there's some serious issues there that were uncovered in the audit. And probably the biggest thing is what has been already said is the best thing that the bar does to protect the public is discipline lawyers who are acting in bad faith, who are unethical. And I think the audit clearly showed that has not been the case. And even more concerning, the favoritism that has been shown, the clear favoritism that has been shown to some lawyers over others. And that's a very big problem for me. So until I can feel really comfortable that some real substantive changes have happened here, and I would agree, I think we need to really look at whether or not we should de-unify the bar. I'm not saying I'm an advocate of that today, but I certainly would really like to look at what that would look like, and considering all that's happened over the course of years here. So for me, I'm going to be voting no today, because I don't think I can in good conscience say that we can authorize these fees and then continue this without real substantive changes being made at the bar.
Mr. Chu. Mr. Chowder. Apologies.
My colleagues have touched upon the possibility of reform or decoupling concept, which I'm basically open for suggestions, but I want to focus in on a couple of specific questions. First question, it's my understanding that future bar dues were at one point used as collateral to secure a building loan. And despite efforts to roll that back or reverse that transaction, certain bar fees are still obligated to use to pay for that loan. Is that not correct? Or how does that restructuring work?
No.
Yeah.
So this is the issue of substituting a debt service reserve fund for a revenue pledge, and that has been completely reversed. So we have now a debt service reserve fund in place.
So none of the membership dues will be used as collateral?
None will.
What was the structure being used in that rollback?
Well, I just want to clarify the structure. So when the bar purchased the LA building, that loan was secured by two types of collateral: a debt service reserve fund and the Howard Street building as collateral for the LA loan. The Howard Street loan, and I want to clarify what that $10 million was for. There's 3 floors of vacant space at our building on Howard Street, the most prime commercial real estate market perhaps in the country, that's been sitting vacant for quite some time. That is space that in order to rent out and to generate revenue from, we need to get it up to a certain standard of occupancy. So that is what the loan for Howard Street was for. The bank originally wanted to secure that loan with another debt service reserve fund. A debt service reserve fund requires you to put money in the bank for the life of the loan that you cannot touch, and is traditionally not an optimal form of collateral because you then cannot use those funds to advance any other goals of your organization. So in lieu of a debt service reserve fund, we went forward with a revenue pledge structure. After getting the feedback that we got, we reversed that transaction. So now both the LA building and the San Francisco building are secured by 2 forms of collateral: a debt service reserve fund and a pledge on the Howard Street building itself. But that debt service reserve is comprised of our general fund monies. So I just want to be clear when we're saying there is no membership fees going to support the building. It is being secured by our general fund dollars, which do include membership fees.
The original idea of using membership due as a collateral, was that the result of the executive director, or was it the result of decision made by the board as a whole?
Well, the board didn't approve the structure, but certainly, I mean, I take responsibility for that idea. I was trying to advance, again, really prudent principles of fiscal management of an organization. If you look back at last year's fee bill, there's a specific requirement that in moving to implement workforce planning recommendations, the bar looks at all of its revenue sources, including its fund balances. So tying up significant amounts of fund balance in a debt service reserve fund does not make much sense when you need to be able to access those dollars to implement legislative priorities. So that was the motivation. I do take responsibility for it. We moved it and advanced it to the Board of Trustees, again, with no intention to tie the legislature's hands on reducing dues.
Got it. Second question, of the 300 plus complaints filed that went unprocessed, how many of them have been serviced or paid attention to as since the time you found out about these 300 complaints?
Right.
What's the status of the investigation on those complaints?
Well, let's see. Several steps have been taken. First, they were reviewed in a triage process to see which ones were meritorious and should move forward. There was then outreach to the L.A. County District Attorney as well as the City Attorney, and I believe also the State Attorney General. And there are now meetings with 2 members of our Regulation and Discipline Committee, the RAD Committee, along with staff from the Office of Chief Trial Counsel, with the L.A. County Attorney. And I believe also meetings with the City Attorney, and they're separating out which jurisdiction should consider handling the various complaints, keeping in mind that there are 2 avenues. One that the bar itself manages is really a civil remedy. but it's a limited impact remedy. And so what we're trying to do is simultaneously offer law enforcement authority the opportunity to consider before the year statute runs whether they have something in one of these that ought to be prosecuted, even as we continue simultaneously to investigate. And I believe after this review, what are our numbers? I think they're about 170. They're well beneath the number of 300. I think it's somewhere in, I'm sorry, I can't be precise, but it's about 120.
Is it correct that most of those 300 complaints deal with UPLs, unlawful practice of law, and immigration related to most of them?
A small part. Very small part, actually.
Thank you.
Ms. Chow. Ms. Garcia, you had a brief follow-up?
Yes, to follow up on Mr. Chu's statement and Chow's statement earlier about these loans, the San Francisco building. And you talked about fiscal management and being responsible fiscal agents. But if we look at the analysis, you took a $10 million loan, and a year prior, you guys adopted rules about what you were going to do when we're going to have expenses of $2 million or more. It looks like you didn't even follow your own rules that you put in there to make sure you were being responsible fiscal management and providing the board with all the information they needed, alternatives. You didn't provide them with risk about this $10 million loan. And so, even if you're implementing these changes to be more fiscally prudent and you're not following them, how are we supposed to believe that you are okay to continue with the current governing structure that you have? Can you respond to that?
So I disagree with that characterization. The cost-benefit analysis, extensive cost-benefit analysis was conducted. The loan is anticipated to be paid off in 5 years, a little over 5 years. And once rented, the space will generate between $2.5 and $2.9 million in new revenue annually. So I think that the math on that is quite simple in terms of the financial viability and value of the loan, and that information was presented to the board. Some of that happened before I arrived, and some of it happened after I arrived. So again, while I take responsibility for the issue on the pledge of revenue, overall, does that loan make sense? Absolutely. What doesn't make sense is to have 3 vacant floors of space in San Francisco at the Embarcadero of commercial real estate, and that was the situation that we had in place.
But presenting the potential benefits or revenue stream does not really present all the risk. As a mathematician and as a person who has real estate investments, there's no guarantees. And is this the most cost-effective in both short-term and long-term? Was that analysis provided? Were alternatives provided to the board so that they could make a more because it's your personal opinion doesn't mean that they're making a fully informed decision of all the risks and all the benefits.
So before we arrived at the bar, the board had made a decision to take out a loan to renovate that space. And certainly when Elizabeth and I came on board, the then president of the board was very clear with us about the priority to execute this loan for the tenant improvement space. So again, that decision about whether or not a loan should be taken out to renovate the space happened before we arrived. What we arrived to was a term sheet from the lender that was not favorable to the bar or thereby to the public or to the dues-paying members. The term sheet had a very severe prepayment penalty, a 10-year term that didn't allow us to prepay without a very significant penalty. We worked to modify that. And in addition, it had the debt service reserve structure. So the decision about whether or not to enter into a loan to renovate the space had happened before we arrived, and that was a clear mandate that we received from the president of the board upon coming into the positions.
Mr. Ting.
Well, I've never felt so good to not be a lawyer today. I just want to clarify my vote. I'm going to support the bill today, but I am 100% in support of what my colleagues have been saying in terms of the reforms that have been needed, and I'll be reserving my right to vote against it if we don't see those changes really adopted into the bill coming on the floor. It's been clear that these issues have been ongoing, as Ms. Garcia has mentioned, and I think that it's time to really, frankly, face the music and make sure that those changes are adopted. It's, I've been in the legislature, it's rare that we have this amount of vociferous opinion from so many attorneys who are unified. I think it's almost impossible to bring so many attorneys together in a unified voice, so congratulations on that. But I think, unfortunately, it also means that the situation has gotten so dire that there really needs to be fairly drastic and immediate action. And I think if I don't see that immediate action, I can't support this bill on the Assembly floor. But I will help you get it out of committee so you can go back to the bar and make those changes. But those changes have to be immediately made.
Thank you, Mr. Tang. Additional questions or comments from the panel? All right, let me weigh in. I have a question, two questions, one from Ms. Parker and one from Mr. Mangers, which I will get to, but let me put them in context. I would like to associate myself with virtually everything Mr. Chu said to kick off this debate and that most of my colleagues have said here. I'm going to vote for this bill, realizing that uppermost in my mind is the picture of Lucy pulling the football out from Charlie Brown again, which is an old reference that goes back to when Mr. Mangers was young. Nevertheless, I'm going to vote for the bill. I think you've heard the objections very clearly. But Mr. Chu is right. We heard those last year, and we were told last year isn't the time to bring them up because the vehicle originated in the Senate, and don't worry, next year we can deal with these problems because the vehicle will originate in the Assembly. We're now dealing with that vehicle, and we still have the same problems. I hear about new bar leadership. We're always hearing about new bar leadership. You've said that before, but the new bar leadership is frankly troubling to me. Within the first week of Mr. Pasternak being elected bar president, I had sent him an email congratulating him, offering to work with him, raising some of these issues, and I got back from him a very nice email saying, yes, he looks forward to working with us. I have never met the man. You said he's been up here walking the halls. Well, maybe he's visiting just Democrats, but Mr. Alejo has never met him either. I've never met you, Ms. Parker. And I find that troubling that new bar leadership is saying, oh, trust us, trust us, trust us, but you haven't sat down in our offices to give us some more detail. I have met on this front, and she's walking up, Ms. Wada, who does a fantastic job for you folks. Fantastic. She's actually the reason I'm going to be voting for this bill today. But there are, to my mind, some disassociations with this new bar leadership and this legislature that is supposed to provide oversight. So with that in mind, my first question. Would you like to answer some of these charges, Ms. Wada? Because I have used your name, but certainly not in vain.
No, I appreciate that, and I won't, I would like to respond to a lot of the comments made here today. I do think that some of them are not entirely accurate, but I wanted to clarify for the record that we have, with every committee member on this in this committee, have attempted to meet with all of them multiple times, including Mr. Alejo, and at points were unavailable. So I just want to make that clear. That conversation has been attempted many times.
All right. So my question. You held up a chart, Ms. Parker, and said when you came in, you were tempted to treat this like a business and look at the business aspects of things and focus on, and I think your phrase was our principal business. I am curious, in your mind, what is the principal business of the bar that you should be focusing on?
And I think that's an obvious answer, so thank you for an easy question. It's public protection, period. First stop. I mean, there's just nothing else. The problem where it becomes, I think, a little difficult is how do you protect the public? One thing is very obvious, and that is we discipline attorneys. But we do a number of other things, too, that feed into this mission, as I think everyone will agree, Mr. Mangers as well. And so the question is, do we say that public protection does not involve, for example, our Judicial Nominations and Evaluation Committee? Does it involve or not our Client Security Fund? Does it involve or not our Lawyer Assistance Program? And, I could go on, and you begin to say, or I began to say to myself, this is more complex than what earlier I understood. Yes, discipline does stand out as a terribly important function, But there are other things as well, and to Mr. Gallagher, I would say, one ongoing concern is how do we prevent particularly small and solo firms from getting caught up in the disciplinary web? We know that they sometimes don't have the systems and the education that they need to avoid these problems. This has been studied. When I point to that, I start talking now about a proactive public protection mission to stop some of these problems before they occur. And so it was in this process, Assemblyman Wagner, that I found myself beginning to say, it's a harder problem than what initially I understood. There are also a middle set of activities, and here Assemblyman Chu mentioned these, where we talk about access to justice, where we talk about legal services. These contribute, I think, to the well-being of our legal system. And at the end of the day, isn't that what the legal system ought to be doing? It is about public protection. And that's why in my opening remarks, I expressed a real concern. Our legal system will not work for us if 85% of our population cannot access lawyers, no matter whether they're diverse, where they come from. This is a reality today. And so public protection, I think, really does then become more integral to what we want our California legal system to be. And that's why I began to think, I was being a little bit glib initially. I do have to stop and think harder. Now, the sections are perhaps the most obvious example that could be equated with a trade association, and some people do, but I think you also heard the sections say, we're about educating our members. We want competent members, but we're also educating the public, and we're also serving you when you decide what kind of legal systems, what kind of laws you should be passing. So all of this is not to say that I have an answer. It's to say that I'm beginning to understand that there are more questions than I realized.
And my question, and that's a great follow-up, is to Mr. Manders, does not your proposal for deunification in large measure, to my mind at least, get us to the point where it sounds like Ms. Parker wants us to be? We're focusing on the principal business, and maybe we can define it broadly or narrowly, but that's for the legislature to do. Doesn't that solve, in your mind, some of the problems that have been raised here?
Mr. Chairman, after 5.5 years serving on this body, I absolutely agree that that is the course of action we must take. This organization is badly distracted from its regulatory functions because of the time it spends on its trade association functions. And I admire Elizabeth as highly as one can, but it is not as complex as being characterized here. The California Medical Association has sections. It has counterparts that mirror every aspect of the bar, and yet it has found over the years that it's quite capable of separating those functions into a liberated trade association that is at liberty to operate without Bagley-Keene, without paying excessive overhead to the state bar. It could form a PAC. It could become a powerful force on behalf of the attorneys in California, except that it's inextricably interrelated with its regulatory functions, and thus it has to bear all of those public burdens that normally it would not. So when we say access to justice, Jenny, all of these things could easily be placed over on the regulatory side because, of course, they're related to public protection. And all of the trade association functions could be separated into their trade association, just as New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, New Jersey, big states comparative, have already done this and are operating just fine. In Nebraska, the Supreme Court ordered the bar to deunify itself in 30 days. Now, Nebraska is not California, I'll warrant. And it will take longer. That's why our proposal, for which there is already language in committee that we've proposed, our proposal would give the bar an entire year to work through those things collaboratively with the chief because of the unique relationship the bar has with the chief and with the Senate side. So it's being portrayed as deeply complex, regrettably, because this competent leadership here inherited chaos. But out of chaos, there should come not just fixes, as Assemblymember Chu suggested. This is a moment for reform, significant reform. And if it can happen in New York and the other major big states that have done it, it can happen here.
Thank you. Additional questions or comments?